All right, guys, what's going on? So if you haven't heard already, apparently the Army Combat Fitness Test, the ACFT, is due for some new changes once again here pretty soon. And you guys know me if you've been following this channel for a while. I'm usually a very positive guy. I usually have a very positive outlook on things. But this is starting to get pretty ridiculous, in my opinion. A new article just came out from military.com that I just happened to come across while I was on here doing my own homework. It's dated for the 7th of December, so I'm a couple weeks late on this, but it reads that the Army will likely have to implement further changes to its embattled fitness test just months after the long-in-development Army Combat Fitness Test, or ACFT, was finally rolled out, as Congress pushes for gender-neutral and potentially job-specific standards. Now, with that being said, I was disappointed when the ACFT officially got rolled out and was the test for record in the Army back last October. I was disappointed to see that the gender standards were different, because I thought that was the whole reason for the ACFT in the first place, or at least one of the major ones. And I don't really like the idea of separating gender standards, especially when it comes to the Army PT test, because it's just going to create a further divide between male and female standards that we already seem to have a hard time dealing with as a force even currently today. Regardless of what your opinion is in that matter, whether females should or should not be serving in combat roles, that's really irrelevant when it comes down to this ACFT, because at the end of the day, everybody in the Army should be being tested equally. At least that's what I think. Because we're all soldiers, right? We're all soldiers, we're all green, we're all expected to be able to perform to the same sorts of standards. So I think the biggest point of contention here is that they've rolled it out in October and they're rethinking it, and they're just saying, hey, you know, that was a big mistake. We should have stuck with gender neutral standards. We're going to have to change it again. But how annoying is this, man? I mean, it's like we finally got the standards outlined for us, exactly what we should be expected to do for this test. And now it looks like it's just going to change again. And we know it isn't going to be an easy process. Every time this thing goes through changes, it's just a long, arduous deal. It not only just for training purposes, but administratively as well. I know all you guys out there that are in charge of DTMS and all you commanders out there are just, they must be just getting so tired of this. The NDAA, which sets the funding and policy priorities for the Pentagon, will require the Army Secretary to revamp the ACFT within 180 days, half a year of the bill's passing, establishing the same fitness standards for men and women that ensure soldiers can perform the duties of their respective jobs. Okay, so let's hone in on that one. So now we're getting into job-specific standards, which I've thought a little bit about that as well, and I think, sure, you know, an infantryman, regardless of their sex, should be able to perform at a higher standard than, you know, your typical MI analyst. I mean, that kind of goes without saying, I suppose. At the same time, on the other side, I also think that every soldier should be performing at a high standard, because I think we all should be considered shooters first. I don't think that should be just a Marine thing. I think that's military in general. I think you should always be considered a shooter first before anything else. I mean, you never know. We could have a serious conflict where every soldier is facing the worst case scenario and they're not able to just sit back at their desk doing their cushy job, whatever it might be. But I guess if I had to choose one or the other, I would say I would definitely want those serving in combat roles to be more physically capable and ready to tackle those sorts of challenges physically than, you know, somebody sitting behind a desk working a nice cushy job. I guess it's not super necessary for them. But then where does that end, right? Does that just mean that they can just get fat and lazy now? Definitely not. The requirement would largely take the ACFT back to what Army planners were hoping for, though widespread skepticism from Capitol Hill and Warmouth, I don't know what Warmouth is, effectively forced the service to have gender-specific standards shortly after a military.com report on early test data showed that half of women could not pass the planned test. Man, so military.com is doing good with this regardless. They're getting plenty of material out of this, right? The poor pass rate for women was partially attributed to the leg tuck, an exercise in which soldiers should be capitalized, by the way, would touch their knees to their elbows on a pull-up bar. That exercise was eliminated in favor of the plank, which is generally seen as a better measurement of core strength. However, the 2-mile run is still the most failed event. First of all, I don't think the plank is generally seen as a better measurement of core strength. And I think a 330 to max that thing is ridiculous. Now, don't confuse that with saying you shouldn't be motivated in order to achieve that. Definitely work towards it and do your best to get that max. We should always be trying to max, regardless of what the policymakers are making us do, right? We're soldiers, we need to perform, and we should always be motivated, dedicated, and very physically fit. That being said, I do not agree in saying that the plank is a better measurement of core strength as opposed to the leg tuck. I mean, there's a reason why people were failing the leg tuck more than the plank. Because it's harder to do, right? So obviously it's going to measure your core strength differently. But I have my own feelings on the leg tuck. I didn't necessarily think that was the best exercise to measure core strength because it is something that's very difficult to gauge. It's very difficult to train up for it. It's very difficult as a grader to actually grade the event. You know, there was a lot of nuances to go along with that event, whether it was for the graders not being able to grade appropriately because they couldn't tell if they were performing the exercise correctly or not. And then the same would go for those that were actually taking the test. You know, they wouldn't necessarily know how to control their body in the right motion to be able to perform an appropriate leg tuck. It's a very difficult exercise to perform. So I just was never sure if the hanging leg tuck should be something that we should expect all soldiers to be able to do to perfect form and, you know, potentially make that a career enhancing or limiting factor. It should be something easy, like the sit-up. They're saying the 2-mile run is still the most failed event. Well, no shit. You put the 2-mile run at the end of everything else. You know how many calories you probably burn by the end of the ACFT? I bet you it's upwards to 800 to 1,000 calories. I've never actually measured it, but it's definitely up there. The ACFT is a serious workout. All that combined is a pretty good workout, which is a good thing. I'm not trying to knock it too hard. I think it's great that it is like a serious test. That's a big day, especially if you're looking to max everything. I mean, I've never gone through an ACFT not just completely smoked by the end of it. I guess it might not be that hard if you're just looking to barely squeeze by on everything and just pass the thing. It might not be that difficult for you, but if you're out there as a motivated soldier and you're trying to, you know, max every single event, then it's a serious workout. And by the time you get to that 2-mile run, your legs are just like jelly. And even if you're normally a 12:30 type of runner like myself, it's hard to pull that off, man, after all that is said and done. So I'm not surprised to see that the 2-miler is the most failed event, not by a long shot. Now, going back to job-specific standards, the service was also aiming for job-specific scoring, the idea being an infantryman needs to be held to a higher standard of physical fitness than a soldier who works in an admin job. Sure, if you look at it in a plain and simple way, if you think, okay, well, the infantryman is most likely going to be in combat more than somebody working a desk job, sure, they should probably be more physically fit. But that doesn't mean that any soldiers working in an admin job doesn't need to be physically fit. They still should be a professional soldier, right? And also, if you start testing the force like that, then somebody who might be working in an admin job that has aspirations to change their MOS, perhaps go into the infantry, might be limited now because they have to be able to meet those same physical standards that they weren't accustomed to meeting during their time in that position. Basically what I'm saying is they're doing PT with their unit, it will be to a lower standard than that of an infantry unit, so therefore if they ever did want to go into the infantry, they would be at a disadvantage because they just weren't physically trained enough for it. I have a hard time buying into these job-specific scoring standards for physical fitness tests because first of all, it just makes everything way more confusing. I mean, when you're talking about career progression and boarding and even just performance, evals, all those sorts of things, now we have to look at all these different sorts of standards that are now job-specific standards in relevance to the fitness that they should be able to upkeep for themselves. Like, that just seems really unnecessary to me. Not only that, but I think every soldier should be held to the same standard, regardless of anything really, you know, regardless of sex, regardless of their job description, they should be able to perform at a high level at any given time. Army planners are already in the early phases of developing separate job standards, but only for combat arms troops, while the rest of the force would likely keep the existing scoring standards. I am very interested to see what that means. Does that mean that the ACFT is now going to be harder for combat arms soldiers? Because that shouldn't be the case. The ACFT is already a pretty difficult test. You know, I just keep looking into this and I keep thinking about how combat arms troops especially are going to react to something like that and how much more complaining we're going to hear. The ACFT took more than a decade, 10 years, to develop, replacing the decades-old Army physical fitness test, or the APFT, which was widely seen as a poor measurement of fitness, grading soldiers only on push-ups, sit-ups, and a 2-mile run. You know, I understand that the APFT was simple. It didn't necessarily gauge your total fitness level. Actually, it just didn't in general, not even necessarily. It just didn't, right? It didn't measure your total fitness as a soldier. But I will say it does seem like soldiers took the APFT much more seriously than they took the ACFT, because it's a lot easier to squeak by on an ACFT than it ever was on an APFT. That's just something I've noticed. I don't know if you guys have noticed anything like that, but it definitely seems like soldiers just aren't as worried about taking an ACFT, and there aren't as many of them that are looking to max it as well, because they feel like it's impossible. Whereas with an APFT, at least you know how I grew up, it seemed like you just had to max that thing. You better max that thing, or you at least get a 90 in every event. So there was some sort of motivation there. Not only that, man, but since we're on the topic, you know, how difficult has it been in your experience to actually implement the ACFT? Because for me, it's been a real pain in the ass. You got to have all that equipment, all that support. Everything has to be set up just right. The time it takes to conduct it. I mean, it's kind of like, it's definitely overkill in my opinion. What was great about the APFT is you could do that thing anywhere. You could do it in the middle of a deployment. You could do it on a soccer field. I mean, you could do it at home with a grader right next to you, just making sure you're doing it right. You didn't need any equipment. You just needed to make sure you had some sort of flat surface, and you could do it the whole thing. Worst case scenario, you could run the track 8 times, get your tube mile done, right? The APFT was just a lot easier, man. But with that being said, I do think it's important that we evolve. I think it's important that we continue to look forward and find new and innovative ways to gauge our physical fitness as a total force, right? And I think that's what the ACFT is eventually supposed to do. We just can't seem to, well, not we, but the policymakers can't seem to make a dedicated decision on what the ACFT should actually look like. And I understand that's got to be a really tough decision, especially since the test is already extremely complicated as it is. And the Army is going through a lot of phasing towards the eventual goal of overall gender neutrality. And I think if that's the end goal, then we need to stick to that. We need to maintain that goal, and no matter what, for better or worse, everything needs to be gender neutral. Because at the end of the day, you either have it or you don't, right? It's either going to be a gender neutral, completely gender neutral force, or there's some sort of variable there that will turn it into a non-gender neutral force. It's one or the other. You can't bend it either way, all right? So we just have to make a decision and stick to it, for better or worse. I'm kind of curious what you guys think on that. You know, I never really asked my followers what you guys think on the gender neutral question as far as the Army goes and the military as a whole. What do you guys think on that? You know, drop some comments. Let me know. I'm curious. Do you think that the ACFT should be gender neutral, or do you think that it should have job-specific standards? Do you like it the way it is, or do you think it needs some changes? And do you want to know what I think? Doesn't really matter what I think. We still have to perform, right? At the end of the day, we can have our opinions, we can have our complaints, but we still have to be good soldiers, and we have to remain adaptable, and we still have to look to crush this PT test, regardless of how it ends up turning out or whatever the standards are on that given day. So that's my biggest piece of advice out of all of this, is just remain adaptable, guys. Keep training hard. You know, try to stay up to date with all these changes. Pay attention to the news. Pay attention to these rollouts. And just do your best to stay motivated through the whole thing. I know it's hard. It's even difficult for me sometimes, guys. You know, I'm getting real, my patience is wearing thin with the ACFT, but, you know, hopefully we can figure this out soon. And hopefully by the end of all of this, by the time the policymakers actually figure everything out and we have a dead set standard, it can end up being a test that we're proud of and that will actually make the force better as a whole, right? But hey, if you guys have any other input, please don't hesitate to drop that in the comments. If you guys have any questions, concerns, anything like that, don't hesitate to drop it in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe. We have tons of other sorts of videos on this channel. We talk about all things fitness, military career enhancement, all sorts of things. So don't forget to like and subscribe if you like that kind of thing. Stay motivated, keep training hard, and besides that, I've got nothing else for you, and I'll see you on the next one.